Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. As we record this podcast on Thursday, it's fair to say that the entire state of Israel is overwhelmed with a tidal wave of emotions. Hope and relief mingled with worry and dread. The wave hit in the wee hours of the morning with the news from President Donald Trump, later confirmed by Israel and Hamas, that the two sides have agreed on the first phase of a deal to end the war in Gaza and secure the release of hostages. President Trump, who led that effort to finalize the agreement, said that the deal means, quote, all of the hostages will be released very soon and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed-upon line as the first steps towards a strong, durable, and everlasting peace. Later on, overnight, he was even more specific, promising hostage families on the phone that their loved ones, living and dead, would be returned home on Monday. Here to discuss the dramatic news with me is Anshel Pfeffer, Israel correspondent for The Economist and author of the biography Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. As our veteran readers know, he was previously a longtime journalist here at Haaretz. Happily, he continues to contribute. Anshel's latest analysis for us is headlined, Netanyahu's Last Stand, How Rewriting the Gaza War Will Decide the Israeli Leader's Political Destiny. Our conversation is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Anshel Pfeffer, good morning and welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Alison. Thanks for having me.
We speak on Thursday after what can only be called a very dramatic night. Before we get into it, Anshel, when you heard the news, was your first instinct to celebrate joyfully along with the rest of the country, already picturing the return of the hostages, or did the experienced journalist in you that sees so many details yet to be hammered out and has seen so many agreements fall apart in the past keep you sober and cautious?
Well, I think that like every Israeli, I've been picturing the day when all the hostages returned for 2 years now. When the tweet, or if we're still allowed to call them tweets, came from Donald Trump about the deal finally being reached. I mean, we'd already been waiting for it for over an hour. We'd seen that note that Marco Rubio handed to him, and we'd were hearing, like other journalists, I was hearing also from a number of directions that had been done. So there was a bit of an anticlimactic feeling, actually, but there's so many emotions flooding at that moment, and it's almost impossible to start kind of picking them apart and saying what we felt. We feel caution, we feel relief and happiness, but yes, it's still many, many obstacles on the way, and until the hostages are out and the fighting ends and all the other things, we have to keep on reporting, we have to remain vigilant, and that's our job.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you that we will see all of the living hostages return on Monday, as President Trump promised?
So I think this time, even though optimism is something we should always be careful from in this region and in our jobs, I think this time the chances do seem quite good. And let's kind of step back just half a step and look at this entire week. And it's incredible because we've been reporting about so many rounds of negotiations and talks over the last nearly 2 years, and so many failed rounds of talks and so many rounds of talks which sort of kind of ended inconclusively and meandered in Doha and in Cairo and other places. There was always something tentative about the talks. And what happened this week is that it was a whirlwind. They took three of the most difficult issues: the release of the Israeli hostages, the list of 1,950 Palestinian prisoners, the temporary, at least, withdrawal line of the IDF. Three huge issues. And in the space of 2.5 days, it was all wrapped up. We've seen so many rounds of talks where the atmosphere and the drive seem to be so different that I think it teaches a really important lesson about peace and diplomacy in the Middle East, is that ultimately the details are always important and the devil is in the details. But the most important thing is the political willpower. And when there's a political will there, and Donald Trump supplied that in bucket loads, in truckloads of political willpower, that really is the main thing. And that's when things can get moving on these deals. And whenever we talk about what are the chances of reviving the diplomatic process and the two-state solution, etc., I think that we always go back to the answer. Yes, there's so many different questions of how such a process would happen and what the different formulas of all the different peace plans. But it does at the end come down to who are the leaders on either side and who are the mediators bringing those leaders together, how strong their convictions are, how confident they are that they can push it forward, and kind of shut out the noises from around, and also, if necessary, disappoint some of their supporters and not cling to their political to their regular political characters and slogans. And I think we saw that in the last 2.5 days, that Trump forced them, and perhaps at some point Netanyahu and Hamas, the Israeli and the Palestinian sides, were also had reached that point where the details were less important than the motivation to actually reach a deal.
So if we're asking why now, why does Trump finally force Netanyahu's hand now? Why does Qatar finally push Hamas hard enough now? Was it the attack on Doha? Was that the catalyst? Is that what pushed it over the edge? Did Netanyahu make a decision and signal to Trump that he was ready to soften more than he has?
So I don't think that there is any one factor which made it happen. I think I think there's a combination of things, and I think that we were already going in this direction over a month ago, when the attack in Doha took place. But it certainly pushed things into hyperspeed. It does seem to have been a catalyzing moment. Like I said, I think that we were still going, and I was hearing from both American and Israeli diplomats just before that they didn't believe that Trump would allow the war to continue for more than a few more months, and he would end it by the end of make sure that it would end by the end of 2025. Certainly the attack in Doha speeded up that timetable.
What do you see as the biggest potential stumbling block to this agreement actually happening and moving beyond the first stage to truly ending the war? Can you point to one factor that you worry about in particular?
Well, I'm very worried about one thing that hasn't been mentioned very much in the last few hours, and that is the bodies. We're constantly hearing about the live hostages, the 20 hostages coming out, and perhaps all coming out on Monday even. And that's obviously massive, and the families of these 20 hostages are, it's impossible for us to imagine what they're feeling right now and going through. But there are 28 other hostages whose bodies are still there in Gaza, and that for some reason it hasn't been mentioned. I've been hearing that perhaps this is actually one point which is being left for a further stage, so that Hamas has some kind of a bargaining leverage towards the next stage of talks and of the ceasefire, and that's concerning because there's a lack of clarity there, and it also means that the hostage issue doesn't end fully and when the live hostages come out. So I think the fact that we don't know exactly what's happening there is concerning. I'm very worried about what could happen on the ground in the next few hours. And anybody who's covered a ceasefire knows that the hours before the ceasefire goes into effect are often the most critical and dangerous hours. Not necessarily something will happen that will scupper the entire deal, but there are. I mean, we have heard reports of the IDF carrying out quite sort of wide attacks in the last few hours. There are on the IDF's list of important targets that it still needs somehow to try and take out before the ceasefire, or whether it's just what they were calling defensive fire. I'm not quite sure at this point, but something there could go wrong. And what's that famous quote from Vietnam? Who wants to be the last soldier to die in Vietnam? And who wants to be the last IDF soldier to die in Gaza? It's not a pleasant thought.
One of the most common sentiments I've been hearing around is it's hard to breathe. People are really, really holding their breath, worried about what's going to play out over the next hours and days.
Yep, I'm hearing it as well from every direction.
Presuming this happens, Anshel, Trump will have accomplished it by breaking many of the rules of the Middle East, crossing Israel's boundaries. He negotiated directly with Hamas. He embraced Qatar, let them lead the negotiations instead of the Egyptians. He invited in Turkey. Will that have larger geopolitical implications for the region? What about the Saudis? What about the Gulf? What about his dreams of expanding the Abraham Accords?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the way Trump has been working in the second term that he's putting a huge store by his ties with the Arab Gulf countries. And don't forget, on his visit, so far his only visit to the Middle East in this term, he didn't come to Israel. He went to Saudi, he went to Qatar, and he went to the United Arab Emirates. Now, that was very telling. And probably the most important meeting leading up to unveiling of the Trump plan last Monday in the White House was a meeting that he had 4 days earlier with a bunch of Arab foreign ministers, and they were mainly these Gulf countries. And I think that's an environment I think Trump feels comfortable in. These Gulf leaders are very comfortable with the kind of leader like Trump, who's, let's say, not a classic democratic leader. He has someone who's doing business deals, or his family members are doing business deals, as part of his own presidency, and that's something that seems very normal for a certain type of Middle Eastern leader. They're all looking at the bottom line at the same time as they're doing diplomacy. The fact that they use family members or very old friends as their personal envoys rather than professional diplomats. I mean, the moment that we heard that both Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who has sort of been absent from this term, were on their way to the talks, I think that was the most important indication that Trump was determined that this time it wouldn't end without a deal. And that's very much in the way he does the different regimes in this region do business, and Trump is working close with them, and that will have an effect over time. I mean, Israel will have to take into account that it may not be Trump's most senior, exclusive, special partner in the region, and it really has to take into account all the other countries that you mentioned.
Anshel, in your latest piece in Haaretz, you stated that journalists wrote the first draft of the history of October 7th and the war in Gaza, and now the second draft of that history is about to be written in the competing narratives of the upcoming elections, and it's all going to be about Bibi. Now, you wrote that before this latest news broke, but I'm wondering, in negotiating an end to this war, how important is shaping this narrative going to be to Netanyahu and his main negotiator, Minister Ron Dermer?
So as far as Dermer is concerned, we all know that Dermer is about to retire from government service. Whether that means that he'll stay in a private capacity as Netanyahu's personal envoy or emissary, I think there's a good chance that happens. But Dermer wants to go into business, and he wants to take advantage of this point in time where he can say, well, we got the deal done, and anyway, I don't have political ambitions, and therefore I'm living. And also, we know that, as someone who lives just a few streets away from Derma in Jerusalem, I know how much he's been in pressure just with the daily protests outside his home. So I don't think Derma is the issue here. The real issue here is Netanyahu's legacy. Netanyahu builds his legacy every single day. He's got a constant, Netanyahu looks at different timelines. He's looking at the political timeline, and that's the election that will be held at some point next year, and quite likely earlier than expected, therefore before October. And he always thinks of his record in history, and this is what he's trying to make this moment into his achievement. That we know how hard Donald Trump had to press him to accept this plan. But Netanyahu was a very pragmatic person. The moment something is forced upon him, he immediately makes it look as if was his idea all along. This was his plan. This is his masterstroke. We're going to be hearing a lot of that over the weeks and months to come towards the election, and we'll be hearing the opposing narratives. We'll be hearing the narratives of the current opposition, who will say, "Well, we also support the Trump plan, and we credit Donald Trump with it. We don't credit you, Netanyahu, and we think that you could have accepted such a plan much earlier. And let's talk about October 7th, and let's talk about the entire war, which you so terribly mismanaged." That's going to be the counter narrative. And there'll also be the narrative here in Israel from the far right of people who are saying to Netanyahu, "You had the historic chance to get rid of 2 million people from Gaza and occupy Gaza in perpetuity and build settlements and end the conflict in that way." And there will be, we'll be hearing that as well. So there'll be these competing narratives, which will dominate, I think, the election campaign in the year to come. It may be a bit less than a year, if the elections are indeed brought forward. Or, as I said, they're the second draft of history, which will be written in the next few months. Professional historians will have to wait until the dust settles from this government and from the Netanyahu era.
So it sounds like you're not assuming that this agreement is going to force compromises that will necessarily facilitate the collapse of the government and short-term immediate elections.
So first of all, you can't have immediate elections in Israel, unlike my home country, Britain, where you can have a snap election in 2 weeks. In Israel, by law, you need at least 90 days after the dissolving of the Knesset for an election campaign. So we're not talking about this happening in the current calendar year. And then the moment that even if the election is brought forward, and even if the far right parties in Netanyahu's coalition make a big show of withdrawing and bringing the government down, by that point is going to be a show. Netanyahu and Netanyahu are still political partners. Netanyahu doesn't have a future coalition, if he has any kind of coalition, without them. So even if we'll see Ben Gvir and Smotrich grandstanding at some point and announcing that they're leaving the coalition, they're resigning, we'll see them criticizing Netanyahu. Behind closed doors, they'll be working together with him on setting a convenient date for the election and then coordinating their election campaigns in a way in which they hope to maximize, once again, as they did in the previous election at the end of 22, the potential far-right vote.
Anshel, we just passed the second anniversary of October 7th. Standing where we are, we look back on other major wars in Israel's history, the Six-Day War, Yom Kippur, Lebanon, and we see how they changed Israel and Israelis. Is it too early for you? You said it's maybe too early for the historians, but personally, do you already feel how you can perceive the way that October 7th and the Gaza war will have changed this country forever?
I'm certain it will, but it's very hard to say at this point how, because Israel is emerging from this war as polarized and as divided as it was on the day before October 7th. And you remember that on the day before October 7th, it was Erev Simchat Torah. What were the newspapers and the news shows talking about? Will there be Hakafot in Tel Aviv, and will there be another clash between religious and secular groups.
For listeners who are not familiar, Hakafot is dancing with the Torah.
And it was such a divisive period, and obviously we were still very much gripped by the struggle over the future of Israeli democracy and the government's attempts to drastically weaken the Supreme Court. That was the atmosphere then, and it's pretty much the atmosphere now. I mean, it may not be over exactly the same issues, but we're seeing the same camps, we're seeing the same themes, we're seeing basically the Netanyahu camp against everyone else. We're also seeing a shift that the Netanyahu camp is smaller now than it was, at least in every opinion poll, but it's still essentially that kind of divide. And very sadly, this election campaign will probably be all about Netanyahu as well. And this second draft of the Gaza war will be about second writing of the historic draft of this war will, in this period, it will in the next few months still be over Netanyahu's role and how responsible he is for the failures, and does he deserve any credit for? I'm not sure why you can call it the success, because ending this war after 2 years is way overdue. But he'll certainly try and take credit for this plan, and the opposition. I mean, we're in a kind of interesting political situation where there's very little argument over the Trump plan. We're seeing 70-80% of Israelis are in favor. Netanyahu's in favor. The opposition is in favor. So they're not arguing over the plan. They're arguing over over everything that happened reaching the plan, and who deserves credit for the plan, and who should be taking the blame for everything that happened before. And ultimately, it's all going to be around Netanyahu, this man who has sucked the air out of the Israeli political system and public life for so many years, will continue to do it, at least for the coming months until the election. And hopefully after the election, we may be able finally to say that the Netanyahu era is ending, but it's premature to predict it right now.
Is it also premature to judge whether the past 2 years have pushed us further away or closer to some sort of sane, I don't want to say peace, I don't want to say, permanent solution, but progress on resolving the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, it looks as far away as it can be at that kind of resolution right now after everything that's happened in the last 2 years. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in polls, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, that there's very little trust or hope right now in some kind of a peaceful solution. But if we look at history, in Israeli history, the Yom Kippur War was such a devastating war as well. And 5-6 years later, Anwar Sadat was in Jerusalem, and the Camp David agreements were in process. So that happened within 5, 6, 7 years. You can go further back into history and see how France and Germany, after 2 deadly world wars, just a few years later, were founding what would become the European Union. And even Israel and Germany, just 7 years after the war, after the Holocaust, signed a reparations agreement. So to say that it's out of the question that within a few years there will be a move to some kind of historic peace between Israelis and Palestinians, you can't rule it out. But like I said, it's very difficult to predict if and when it's going to happen right now.
Finally, Anshel, speaking of Europe, I can't forget that you are a native of Manchester in the UK, a self-described proud British Jew. So let me add to the previous question as to how you think this war, the past 2 years, will have changed the diaspora's relationship to Israel, changed the diaspora, given the huge wave of anti-Semitism it's experienced, and whether you think, beyond the diaspora, to its relationship with the world, whether you think Israel will be able to roll back the tide of this huge blow to its diplomatic status and image worldwide.
I think that as far as the diaspora is concerned, and each and every Jewish community around the world, this has been a very, very tough 2 years, very sobering time, in which perhaps what were perhaps illusions of the security and safety they enjoyed in their countries. I wouldn't say there's illusions. Maybe they weren't totally illusions, but there were certainly massive question marks over first of all, their relationship with it, with the communities and society in which they live in before we begin to talk about their relationship with Israel, but also their relationship with Israel, because who can say now that Israel is the safe haven for Jews after everything that's happened on the other side? Who can say that it's safe for Jews to live in countries which did seem very safe and secure around the world? So it's it's been 2 years of living dangerously, and there's a need for a lot of assessment. But I think I see, we keep getting back to this point. We've been in this crazy, chaotic, awful period for 2 years to try and predict how we'll return to normalcy, whether it's here in Israel, whether it's in the diaspora, whether it's in the relationship between Israel and diaspora. And we need this period, we need a period of relative calm to kind of regain our sanity. I mean, certainly Israel has nothing to teach the Jews of the diaspora anymore about safety. If the reaction of an Israeli minister to the awful attack on Yom Kippur, in which 2 Jews were killed in Manchester, is to invite one of the most despicable racist thugs from Britain, Tommy Robinson, as his which is nickname, but his real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, and he's like really the dregs of racism in Britain. And he's now, according to our diaspora affairs minister, Shikli,
Amichai Shikli.
Yeah, I mean, it just beggars belief that he has the authority to invite someone like Yaxley Lennon Robinson as an official guest. I mean, I've spoken to people in the foreign ministry here in Jerusalem, but they're shocked, and so why isn't Gideon Sa'ar saying anything? Well, and then they kind of shrug, and the real answer is the Likud primary. So it's really a race to the bottom in the Likud, and this is just a symptom of it. But I mean, I've been speaking since the Manchester attack to so many friends in Britain, and to various people there in the community, also some quite senior people, and they're all shocked by this invitation. You saw the way in which the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council came out fiercely against this invitation. So I'm sorry for going on about this. I know this is not the main issue that we're supposed to talk about today, but it just goes to show how on so many really core issues of policy, this government has just totally lost the plot. Also, when it comes to relationship with the diaspora, and the only thing that can fix this is an election and hopefully a change of government, and that's still a few more months down the road, and probably we'll meet here on this podcast again to discuss it at some point.
Well, I hope we do. Anshel Pfeffer, Israel correspondent for The Economist, who will always have a second home here at Haaretz. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights and analysis here as well as on our website.
Always a pleasure, Alison, to be on the podcast.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Anshel Pfeffer, to producer Avi Rosenzweig, and editor Nara Malkin. If you want to continue to listen to our podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating on your platform of choice so more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.